Hello, class. It's definitely good to be with you all again. I want to dive in to talking about the last couple of central tenets of critical race theory, or ideas that are related to the central tenets of critical race theory, so that you can study for your midterm. I know you've already been doing that, and this will just solidify your knowledge. It's not going to give you anything necessarily new, but just help solidify your knowledge. So I just want to make sure that we quickly review, and then I just want to talk about the empathetic fallacy and then power. And in so many ways, we've already covered those, but I just want to make sure that you have the best understanding that you can for the midterm. So again, we know that race is a social construction. It's a biological myth that has evolved into a sociological fact. We know that racism is the father of race and not the other way around, because racism is that system of dividing people, and then race is a tool that was created to make racism work. And so we know that even though race is not biological or genetic, it still can have life or death consequences, because even though it is a biological myth, it is most certainly a sociological fact. We know that racism is ordinary. It is ingrained into the fibers and fabrics of our society. And we know that this is the type of racism that we recognize, this picture. However, now that we are taking this class, we have started to understand that there is perhaps racism that we do not see, or that we attribute to other things, but that is embedded into our structures, systems, and institutions. So racism is ordinary. It's so ordinary that we all are racist. How? Not because we're bigots, not because we go around exercising our prejudices and harming people, but because we all participate in this system of hierarchy. We feed into it knowingly and unknowingly, because again, it is woven through and through how and what we do in our daily lives. And so in talking about the racism that we do not see, we dove into speaking about microaggressions, which were the everyday verbal and nonverbal environmental slights and insults that are targeted at a given population. Someone clutching their purse in an elevator, someone asking an Asian person whether they can see because of the shape and size of their eyes. And then we talked about that slide, sort of led us into this idea of intersectionality, because people are exposed to many, many microaggressions for many different reasons, because our identities are complex and complicated. They are not static. We don't just have one single uncomplicated identity. Our identity is made up of many, many things. And because of that, those things combine, or those things intersect to affect the way that we are treated and the access that we have in society. And that's a visual representation of intersectionality. And then we move to talking about institutional and structural racism, those laws, customs, and practices which systematically reflect and reproduce racial inequalities. That is the way in which microaggressions function and work together, the way in which the system of racism functions and works, the way that power works, all of those things, the way that white supremacy works, all of those things are embedded into our institutions and structures and systems, and they reproduce the structural inequalities that we know to exist. And one example of that was the sheer percentages of Hispanic men, and especially Black men, in the jail and prison system that have been caught up in the criminal justice system, as opposed to white men. And so that led us to a discussion of differential racialization, which is the way that the dominant society racializes or defines the characteristics of different minority groups in different ways at different times in response to its shifting needs. So the definition of what makes someone fit into a certain racial category, how somebody is racialized, what racial characteristics count, or what characteristics count as far as racializing somebody, changes over time depending on what the majority needs. And that is because whiteness is property. Being able to be in this group of white people, to have this legal status of whiteness, is property, and it's very valuable in this country. And because this idea of whiteness, this concept of whiteness is privileged and creates so many benefits for some groups and problems and issues and inequalities for other groups, it's important, according to critical race theorists, that when we talk about race and when we talk about the experiences of minorities, we must privilege our unique and authentic voices. We must privilege our unique and authentic voices because we operate under a belief that minority writers, people of color, people who are marginalized, writers and thinkers are generally in a better position than white writers and thinkers to write and speak about race and racism because of what we experience daily. We are more experts on that topic. And then we talked more about structural inequality and how inequality is embedded into our system. And then that led us into a discussion about so we talked about color blindness, which essentially we'll talk about that a little bit more. I'll link it back when we talk about the empathetic fallacy. So we'll skip that for now. And then, yes, we mentioned structural inequalities that are maintained through structured institutions like the school system, standardized testing, and other ways. Inequality that's embedded into our structures and systems. And then last time we talked about racial idealism versus racial realism. And idealism holds that race and discrimination, it comes from attitudes and social formations, and that it's these words, these stereotypes, these categories, and these symbols. And if we can get rid of them, we can rid ourselves of racism. Realism says no, race is deeper than that. Race is more than just skin deep. Race is embedded into our daily lives in so many different ways that we can see and ways that we cannot see. And realists also argue that material determinism, interest convergence, the economic structures are the foundation for structural racism. People wanted money, people wanted wealth, people wanted power, people wanted a capitalistic gain. And so in order for them to justify the cruelties that they came up with to put people into hierarchies and to divide us into haves and have-nots, in-groups and out-groups, in order to justify doing that, and in order to have that system work, we had to use race as a tool, and is a very effective tool in order to obtain those material factors. And so that's material determinism and interest convergence that says that the majority group only tolerates advancements in racial justice. If you go back and you truly examine history, you will see that the majority group tolerates advancements in racial justice only when it suits its own interest to do so. When there are material factors at play like money, imperialism, capitalism, power, global hegemony, global leadership, authority, and others involved, the dominant group may tolerate temporary racial advancements when it suits them. They engage in this cost-benefit analysis of sorts, implicitly and explicitly, that says, we can tolerate this advancement for this group because it's going to yield greater benefits for us. But it's always temporary, which was one of Bell's chief arguments following Brown versus Board of Education, that whatever the process looked like, not only did it not actually exist in the real world, like real progress didn't actually happen, it was just like de jure on paper, but not actually in practice, but also even in the alternative, even if there was some form of progress, it was only temporary, because eventually things will go back either to how things were before or even worse, unfortunately. Which brings us to this idea of the empathetic fallacy, this idea that racism is far more than just something that is in the minds and hearts of people. It's something that is embedded into what we do in society. It's embedded into our daily lives. It's part of the structure of our government. It's woven into the fabric of our society. And so this empathetic fallacy, a fallacy is essentially just something that is wrong. It is incorrect. A fallacy, it is a flaw in logic. This empathetic flaw in logic, empathetic fallacy, is a belief that one can change a narrative, an idea, by just offering an alternative narrative in hopes that the listener's empathy will quickly and reliably take over. So if there is this narrative that exists in like media, in film, in the spoken word, in poetry, and whatever, that says that Black people are lazy, empathetic fallacy says, and much like colorblindness argues that we just need to treat people well, we just need to treat people properly. The empathetic fallacy similarly says that oh, as long as we get rid of this narrative, let's get rid ourselves of all of these writings, all of the literature, all of the statues, all of the things that reflect racism or that push this narrative that Black people are bad people, or that another group of people are bad people, or that push these racist ideologies. If we can just get rid of those, then and if people would just listen to the struggles of various groups, then their empathy will take over and we will get rid of racism. Let's just sit down, talk, have a conversation, have a conversation, have a conversation. And this has been a narrative, for a prevailing narrative, for a really, really, really long time. However, critical race theorists argue that you have got to, especially from the realist school, you've got to have a realistic approach toward racism and realize that it is far more than just having a conversation. The founding fathers knew, when they were saying that all men were created equal, that they were literally dehumanizing enslaved African people, and they did not do anything about it. That is what gives rise to this idea that it is about money and wealth and power and capitalism. That is what racism is about, and not necessarily just a narrative that a certain group of people is bad. Changing that narrative won't do any good insofar as the material wealth is the goal. And so that brings us to what our final sort of lecture regarding stuff you're going to need for the midterm, which is the idea of power. Power is the ability to get someone to do what you want them to do. The ability to get someone to do what you want them to do. It's very simple. Power. And power, we see power dynamics in everything that we do, in our relationships, our interpersonal, romantic, friendship relationships. We see power in teacher-student relationships, in attorney-client relationships, in all sorts of relationships. There is a power dynamic. Somebody holds power. Sometimes both people hold power, but somebody always holds more power and has a greater ability to get somebody to do what they want them to do. So where does power come from? Are we just born with it? How do we get power? Well, you should know that there are many sources of power. There are many sources of power. And actually, I left one off. I'm just going to add it here. Just stay on with me as though I'm in class. I'm going to add that there because I left one off, which is a very important one. So I'm going to share and reshare. I added it back. All right, power. Back to the big screen. Power is the ability to get somebody to do what you want them to do. And power has various sources. Physical force, actually being bigger, stronger, having more weaponry. Think about the police and the level of power that they have because they are armed just by being able to enact brute physical force. If you are thinking about resisting a police officer, or even if you're not, more than likely you're going to do what they say do because you remember that they've got a gun. You remember that they've got a taser. You remember that they've got a club. Same thing with the military. But just being able to enact brute physical force gives you power. And just in your regular life, if somebody's bigger than you, they can probably get you to do what they want them to do, by physical force. Wealth is another one. Wealth is absolutely a source of power. You can literally just buy what you want to do. That's why big businesses and people that have the money to lobby the government and rich people are able to get laws that are passed for their benefit because they've got the wealth to have the power. And then there's state action. There's state action. The being backed by the state. The state has the ability to compel people to do things. The state has the ability to make people do things because the state can send you to jail. The state can fine you. The state can tell you where to park because the state can write you a parking ticket. That is state action. In a democracy, theoretically, maybe not always so, or most of the time, maybe even not so, depending on how cynical you are toward democracy. Theoretically, our legislators and our elected officials get their power from the people because we elect them. So that is an example of state action. The state meaning the government, meaning our government, not just our state like Texas, but the government, the nation state, the country. Social norms is another source of power. What do people think you should do? That's power. The peer pressure is power. You want to be accepted in society, so you do what people say do. Ideas. If you have a good enough idea, a strong enough idea that motivates the masses, that is a source of power. If you can motivate the masses with your ideas. And finally, the one that I left off, I don't know how I did that, is numbers. Numbers, a vocal mass, a vocal majority, collective intensity provides a theoretical legitimacy. Numbers, having just sheer numbers makes you or gives you more power. So those are the sources of power. And then there are three important laws of power. There are more, but there are three important laws of power that we should mention. Number one, power is never static, meaning stationary. It's never standing still. You are either gaining power or you're losing power, which is why there's always these struggle for power in various dynamics, especially as it relates to like the state and state action. Number two, power flows like a current. It flows like water. It flows from thing to thing, from person to person. Power is always flowing. And policy, when you enact policies, it is a way of freezing that power. It is a way of freezing that power. If you give someone a certain amount of power and then you pass a law that says that person keeps the power, that policies are a way to freeze power, because otherwise power is flowing constantly. And then number three, power compounds. Power compounds. If you have power, it is likely that you can use that power and you will use that power to gain more power. And in the same way that power combines, powerlessness combines. Powerlessness combines. Because if the poor or if marginalized peoples, if all they have are the ability to use physical force in order to like help themselves and they have no other form of power derived from any other source, then their powerlessness will continue to just combine and they will be perpetually powerless, in the same way that the rich and powerful continue to remain rich and powerful even after their death, from generation to generation. That's power. And so those are, and I will send out this PowerPoint and an announcement later today, but you have the most of it and you should have been watching the other lectures, and I know you've been doing your readings and all of that. And so these are, I have given you essentially everything that you need to do well on the midterm tomorrow. So good luck to you. I know that you will do well. I will still be sending out just a couple more things before the day is over. However, I hope that you can find all of these lectures useful, watch them as many times as you need. I hope that the midterm will go well for you guys. Thank you so much, and I'll be back with you soon.